So this is going to be quite a serious video. It's about the sort of heroes of Chernobyl, the liquidators, and a lot of the other people involved in the Chernobyl disaster. So a very quick background for those of you that don't know much about it. On the 26th of April 1986 at about 1 AM, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, the Vladimir Lenin power plant, reactor number 4 exploded due to a failed safety test and sort of faulty reactor design. Now, what happens if a nuclear reactor literally explodes is that huge amounts of radioactive material are spewed out from it, and these radioactive materials will kill people, because why? Nuclear power is a very good source of energy. Obviously, if it goes wrong, it can go very, very wrong. So what ended up happening was, initially firefighters responded not knowing that they were fighting basically a nuclear fire at the power plant, and they were exposed to lethal amounts of radiation. Many of them immediately died. Others would have, developed cancers later on, or passed, genetics that were damaged onto their children and families. And as well as, the plant workers that were initially killed or irradiated as well in it. What ended up happening is there was a massive cleanup operation done at Pripyat and Chernobyl because of, the scale of the disaster. Now, there had been nothing prior to Chernobyl of its size in terms of nuclear disasters. Yes, there had been contamination from nuclear bomb tests and nuclear bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And yes, there had been other nuclear power plants and nuclear industry disasters before, but nothing on the scale of Chernobyl. And thankfully there's been nothing since, although there was the Fukushima disaster in Japan. That, again, compared to Chernobyl, was incredibly minor, if you think about the grand scheme of things. Now, because of the size of the Chernobyl disaster, over 600,000 people were called in to deal with it. These were known as liquidators, and the whole idea was that they were in a clean-up operation to basically reduce the amount of radiation spreading from the zone and the burnt-out reactor. So the people in the town of Pripyat that was next to the Lenin power plant, they were eventually evacuated within about a day or two of the explosion happening. And, many of those people would have probably died from cancers later on. Now, the problem is with something like Chernobyl is we don't really know the full scale of it. You have quite low initial figures for the people who died initially, such as the firefighters and the plant workers, as well as a helicopter that crashed, which comes to around 30 or so people. But obviously, the numbers affected by Chernobyl could be getting close to 100,000 now. So out of those 600,000 liquidators, many of them will have died of cancers, or many of them will, have developed cancers. Now, with radiation, there's two ways you essentially die from it. You'll either die from a massive radiation dose, which develops in radiation sickness or acute radiation sickness. And that's where, you die simply just through the massive amount of radiation your body's absorbed. However, what will happen with a lot of people is you won't get an initial blast of radiation big enough to kill you outright, but you will develop, cancers and other health defects later on. Or, sadly, you can pass on genetic damage to your children. Sort of, if you have children once, you've had this, damage done to your genes being scrambled by radiation. Unfortunately, you often won't know till later on that you've done, essentially passed on the damage. So, the liquidators, what they did was they had these 600,000 men and women that went in, were involved in all sorts of clean-up operations. You had miners that went underneath the power plant to try and reinforce the floor and excavate areas to prevent, the molten reactor material going down into the groundwater. You had divers and firemen go in to open valves and pump out water from the basement of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant to, stop again this sort of complete disaster situation that could have unfolded. Because as bad as the initial radiation leak was in the reactor fire, what could have potentially happened was if the radioactive material melted through the floor, what could have then happened is it could have caused a massive thermal explosion of several megatons, which would have been a giant dirty bomb, because it would have taken out what remained of the number 4 reactor building and the number 1, 2 and 3 reactor buildings. And that would have probably wiped out most life in Europe, because what would happen was you'd have a, just a massive amount of radioactive material that wouldn't go away, just blown all across Europe, west and east, maybe north and south. And that would just poison the earth, basically, as well as radiation getting into the drinking water for millions of people. So what the Chernobyl liquidators did was incredibly brave, and their self-sacrifice should always be remembered. This is one of those sort of wars where everybody involved was a good person, you know, at fighting this, because they were fighting, you know, almost like a natural disaster. Although it was caused by humans, they were fighting, you know, the spread of radiation that would have killed many, many innocent people. So they very bravely, you know, sacrificed themselves, essentially, and their future health to do a clean-up operation. You had men on the roof shoveling the radioactive material back in, so a containment sarcophagus could have been built around the power plant. You also had helicopter crews flying overhead into plumes of massive amounts of radiation to dump sand in, and boron to stop, you know, as much of the fire as possible and smother it. You know, and there were lots of doctors and things involved as well who would have got big radiation doses from treating then those people that had been irradiated, because if you've been irradiated, your body continues to give off radiation, it doesn't just stop. So obviously this is just really a thank you video for them, for saving so many people and to raise awareness. Now HBO Chernobyl's come out, that's done a very good job, I think, at alerting more people to what actually happened during the Chernobyl disaster and the clean-up operation involved. But unfortunately there's still a large amount of people online who will say things like, oh, Chernobyl wasn't really that bad, you know, there wasn't really any serious disaster, only like 30 people died, it was a minor thing. No, Chernobyl was massive and it could have been even bigger. It could have wiped out millions of people if the Liquidators didn't do what they did. So as I said, this is just sort of a bit of a historical information video and a thank you video to them. That's Liquidators medal, because the Soviets built absolutely massive of these medals, so if I just zoom in on the text, if you can read Cyrillic you'll be able to read that, or Russian you'll be able to read that, but you can see the alpha, beta and gamma contaminating the blood of the people who volunteered, you know, or were conscripted to fight the disaster. So if you would like to know more about Chernobyl, please look up some of the documentaries or read up on it. You know, it's a very stark, bleak thing. And as I said, just another big thank you, and sort of, you know, rest in peace to all those people involved in the clean-up who, you know, saved so many lives by giving their own.